All right, let's get started for today. So hope you're having a good Friday. We are now wrapping up the 4th week. So we're about a month in and moving right along with stuff. I know that for a lot of you, you probably spent a lot of your time in the evening on Wednesday with working on your paper and wrapping up that listening assessment assignment. So thank you for turning that in. If you're still working on that, remember that you can turn it in up to a week late with your get out of jail free card if you choose to use it, or it's -5% for each day that it's late. So please get it in when you can. Again, this is a shorter assignment that's designed to help you with starting to think about and engage with listening and just some writing skills as well. So for this assignment, I will be trying to turn around feedback as soon as I can. You might have noticed if you check the schedule and the syllabus that we have another writing assignment that's coming up because of the snow days and cancellations and things. I'm going to push that back and have the next assignment due over 2 weeks from now. So what I'll do is after class today, I'll be posting the assignment, and then next Monday we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail because I want you to have a bit of a breather between assignments and also the opportunity to use the feedback on a shorter assignment to help you as you're working on some of the later stuff. So what I want to have us start by doing is just to share what we've put together for this project. So again, I ask you for this short writing assignment to use a conversation with somebody else that happened in class as an opportunity to think about listening, including the steps of listening that you incorporated and the ways that you use active listening as part of the process too. And it's a way for us to hear from everybody about what you put together and what ended up happening through that project. So what I'd like us to do is go around and we'll have people share the conversation that they use, the steps of listening that they incorporated, and the ways that they use active listening. So Destiny, let's start with you.
So the conversation that I used for this assignment was one in class, and it was basically just about like a scary camping trip type thing. I can't remember his name. I'm sorry, I'm really bad with names, but all I know is that it was a really good story, so it was really easy to write about. And then, yeah, and so how did I use the steps of listening in my conversation? I kind of did it unintentionally, like I was thinking about it throughout the conversation, but I didn't want to think too much about using every single step. And it wasn't until I was writing the assignment where I realized that I did end up using every step of the listening process. And then I incorporated active listening just mostly through my body language and kind of nonverbal communication. And that was basically it.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. Active listening or steps of the listening process are not things we think about as much in the moment, but as we reflect on and incorporate that later into writing, it's something that stands out. Wow, I did this. I listened in this way, right? And that's something that I appreciate you sharing and bringing. I'm curious, is there anybody that's here today who was that scary camping trip story that Destiny? Guess it's a mystery about who that person is. Maybe somebody who didn't make it today. We'll see, I guess. So why don't we go ahead and hear from folks that are here face-to-face for today, starting with you.
So I had a conversation with Kenan, and basically it was a relatable story. So
Sure.
It made it easier to listen to. And then with Kenan being like one of my friends, it's easier just to listen and understand where he's coming from. I was able to receive the message really well just because I was able to make eye contact. We sit right next to each other and we'll talk.
Sure.
Listen, I was able to give my response with verbal and nonverbal cues. And then basically it was just a relatable story just because I went on a trip similar to his. So when I gave my story, it was just a trip. That was just like his. We both went to NFL games. And it was
Sure. Yeah. Right, Willie. So the idea of relatability matters a lot. Oftentimes we're more likely to recall or even to focus and attend to information in the moment, right? If we find it relatable and identifiable to us. So I think that's a good observation about how the listening process can happen.
Okay. I had a conversation with Willie, like he said, it was like just a friend conversation, really relaxed. It's pretty easy just to talk to him about like the stories that we had. How did you use steps of listening conversation? Yeah, definitely receiving the message was a lot easier with a friend. Interpreting. What does it mean by interpreting the conversation?
Like taking the words and putting it together in a way that makes sense like a story.
Oh, totally. Like the end story of Willie was obviously that he like wanted to be a coach and like get into coaching and stuff like that. I could kind of tell that's what the story was leaning towards. Definitely recalling his story was a lot easier, especially because it was fairly recent and actually a really cool, story to listen to going to a Cowboys game. Overall, his story, like evaluating story, was pretty good.
Yeah.
I thought he did a good job explaining details and all the fun stuff that he was able to do. And then responding, I was just able to give him nonverbal cues, eye contact, be able to talk to him, stuff like that.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing, Kaden. I think that the additions and like how you're paying attention, listening, and following along are all really good ways to think about that whole listening process.
I also had a conversation with Billy about the same story.
Yeah.
I admittedly remembered less details about the story than Dana did, so I can't really add much there. But so on the steps listening to the conversation, receiving was actually, for me, it wasn't quite as easy because there was actually a lot of background noise. In the time everyone's having their own conversations, I wasn't as, I guess, related to the story maybe it was, so I'll get harder to sit on that, but I still believe that I got the gist of it. Seemed relatively straightforward, like Ian said, it was a pretty relaxed, low-key conversation. It was a very straightforward story. Interpreting it, again, for the most part, easy, just having him tell the story about he went to the NFL game in Texas, and just like looking at his nonverbal cues, hand motions, how he was, the tone of his voice, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, so I really like the way you bring in that when maybe it's less personally relatable as a story, things like background noise can be a much bigger deal, right? If you're really focused and really find a message relatable, sometimes those background elements can be annoying, right? You can be frustrated with them, or other times they can take over if the message is not connecting quite as much, right? So background noise can definitely differ in its significance in the way that it impacts your overall conversation. So move to back here.
The conversation that I used was with Marisol and we're to California. The steps of listening that I used was basically just like listening to her and gathering information and then giving her feedback on it. And then the way that I incorporated active listening was eye contact and like shaking my head, like affirmation that I was listening.
Yeah. Yeah, the process of syncing nonverbal feedback, right, can be a really important issue. That yes, you give nonverbal feedback, but you want it to better correspond and show you're listening over the conversation. Yeah.
I was in quarantine, so I interviewed a roommate. And their story was about they hit 2 deer.
Oh,
So,
wow.
Like not like at once, but like yeah.
I was gonna say it once would be impressive.
Yeah. And I used the steps of listening I used it to kind of just like formulate responses of like how my body language was. Like if they were like making a joke out of it, I would like laugh, or if they were like serious, I would laugh. I incorporated active listening, like I said, for the steps of listening, like my body language and my eye contact and like what kind of facial expressions I was making, so that they felt like what they were saying was important. That I was listening.
Yeah, yeah. Again, I like that there's this greater emphasis on how you're using nonverbal cues and incorporating them to show your listening. That's a great point. Yeah.
So for mine, I use the interaction between Macy, Travis, and I over Zoom. What about those two stories?
Sure.
And for the listening process, it received the things they're saying for the screen, obviously, but everyone had their cameras off, so there
Sure.
wasn't that nonverbal communication. And then for interpreting, I compared mostly Macy's story just because the emotions were similar to the story that I shared actually. So I made connections to my own story. And then as for recalling it, I was able to put it into my short-term memory. And not write it on paper in general, just 'cause I remember the details of the story through connecting it, in the interpreting process. And then evaluating, I didn't necessarily need to make judgments for credibility and completeness, because I listen my own brain, I didn't really need to see, I guess, if their information is credible or not, because it didn't seem necessary, I guess, in my own process. And then responding, honestly, would say like yes or laugh at something that they were saying. And then for implementing active listening, for me personally, making sure that I was in a room with no background noise, where the Wi-Fi connection was good.
Yeah.
Would be a form of positive active listening, just because I was making sure that there wasn't that background noise, so that I can hear everything they were saying and less distractions for me mentally.
As you brought up, right, the challenge of using something like Zoom, where video is not always on, right, is picking up on the message, and like you mentioned, just really trying to create it as a focused, concentrated space. I like some of the ways you brought up those ideas of pre-listening, creating that listenable environment, right, to make sense of, especially happening digitally, the message too. Presley?
I had a conversation with Fatima. I feel like her story was pretty eventful, so it was easy for me to recall later. I obviously, like how I practice active listening was I turned around, make sure I was facing her, eye contact. There were times like where I didn't understand because of the background noise. So I would like interrupt and say, what was that again? Or what did you say? And I probably could have waited till the end, but just like, so I remembered, I made sure to ask like during the conversation. But
Yeah, the appropriate time to like ask for clarifying questions can be a challenge, because you want to keep up, and at the same time, you also don't want to interrupt or cut somebody off. So I think oftentimes, like over time, using things like nonverbal cues, or figuring out as you get to know somebody when the appropriate time is to ask for clarification.
I was someone talking how she was on good experience on that. When I mostly do the active listening, I mostly do like look around the room, just picture of the story, so like looking at eye contact.
Sure.
In the beginning I did, and I started looking at thinking what she's saying about the story. It's like another way for me to like try and go with the story that she's thought about. And most of them looking straight forward and after questions to the end, like what is this? Because I used to play all up before, but not really calling from now.
Yeah.
I don't understand what she's talking about.
Yeah. Right. So a lot of like memory research has found that we tend to remember the very beginning and end of something, including a conversation the most, right? Recalling, remembering, and thinking back on elements of the conversation can definitely be a challenge, especially in those details. And even thinking back like to the telephone gig and Willie's story in the beginning, right? Some of those details over time were being lost, and that played a role in how we understood the message. So I appreciate you sharing some of the ways you're listening. Yeah. Zach.
Well, so for my conversation, I wasn't here in class, so I had a FaceTime call with my parents, and we talked about a trip that we were taking over spring break. And I noticed that while I was talking to my parents, I kind of picked up on only certain information, like the dates that we were going. It was kind of whenever something caught my attention. For me, the way that I incorporated active listening was I went into my bedroom, I turned off all of the electronics except for my light, and I put in my AirPods so I could clearly hear what they were saying. And I propped my phone up so I could see, obviously, their entire body.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Zach. You know, the elements of creating good, again, listenable environments and digital spaces can be a challenge, right? So that can also be a challenge in things like disparities and access, right? And all of those things. For instance, not everybody has like stable access to a good space for something like a Zoom meeting or a Facebook call, right? And we've definitely seen that a lot over the past couple of years for folks who have taken classes through Zoom where people have required cameras on. That can oftentimes be an unsettling and challenging thing because maybe you don't want to be seen, or maybe you don't feel comfortable having your location broadcast, right? So definitely creating a good listenable environment, thinking about the ways that you're able to prepare are pretty important. Yeah, Casey.
So I was on Zoom for this class, so I decided to have a different conversation with my friend just to be easier.
Sure.
For me to like use all the steps of listening and after listening, and write about it. And so I think that most of the listening steps were pretty unconscious for me,
Sure.
except for receiving. Actually, I remember being hungry, like when we had the conversation, and so I had to like force myself to pay attention and not like
Right.
think about what I was feeling. And then responding, I obviously like based on her what she was saying and facial expressions and stuff. Like there was times where there were like clear pauses where I could like ask questions, and I would do that. And I incorporated active listening just by adjusting my body. So like making sure I was facing my friend and giving appropriate facial expressions, which was not that hard just because she was telling, I asked her about like a significant or memorable story like we kind of did in class.
Yeah.
And she told me one that was like kind of like paranormal activity-ish.
Cool.
So it wasn't hard to like pay attention because it was very interesting.
Sure. Right. Interesting topics and novelty play a big role too. I also like you're mentioning like being kind of hungry and the way that physiological elements are right, a form of noise that affect our listening too. We want to be good listeners, but we're also human, right? And we've got a lot of those things that can go on in the background and impact our communication. Appreciate you, Sean. Yeah.
My conversation was improved. I think I just used the steps of listening to help me understand and relate to the conversation. And then I incorporated active listening by just keeping eye contact, like facial expressions, and then the one word notice is just like show that you engage.
Yeah, right. Like listening is a marathon, not a sprint, right? It's that continuous focus on chosen skills. Cool. Sure. Yeah. 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 Right? It draws you in when you find a point of connection, something you share in common for sure.
I honestly don't remember the conversation we had at all, so I just kind of thought about skiing or something like that. It was something random like that.
Sure.
But in the moment, I did do active listening by really focusing on interpreting and evaluating and responding to show probably that I was listening. I actually what was being said, and I showed that I knew what to say.
Yeah. There are moments, right, where in that particular time, like there's good and active and engaged listening, but maybe there isn't a whole lot of recalling here, right? Sometimes conversations or phone calls with friends and family that are lively, that are fun or interesting in the moment, especially if they're on topics that aren't as serious or intense, right, might not be things you stick around with a whole lot longer in your head. So that can be a thing we can think about too.
Yeah, so our conversation is also in class, and it was about moving from a smaller area or a bigger town to a smaller town of Will. And so on. And
sure.
So yeah, it was pretty much just standard for all the steps, but recalling and responding came pretty easily because I related to the story personally as well. It was pretty much same situation for me, so it made it easier to remember and it gave for some easy feedback at the end to like find common ground and then Yeah, same active listening, keeping eye contact, trying to stay more focused, especially in the crowded classroom and stuff.
Sure.
Yeah, just really-
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Again, having the physiological noise and the like presence of other people talking as you are definitely add a lot of challenge. I know that we took a lot of time talking through this, but I think it was worth it, really valuable to hear, the conversations that you all chose, some of the things that you learned from that process, right? It's a good opportunity for us to share and to hear some of the things that each of us has learned by doing this activity, right? Some things that particularly stood out to me were the ways that you all were preparing and making the space one for listening, again, including the use of pre-listening in digital spaces. The way that you all kind of thought about nonverbal communication, your gestures, your facial expressions, and all of those things. And also the role of recalling, right? That it can be hard to remember the exact details of conversations with others. And there are situations where we don't necessarily hear all the details, but we do pick out things that are interesting, relatable, or meaningful to us that we can use and incorporate later. So it sounds like this was an activity that went pretty well and an opportunity, again, to think about these ideas a little bit more deeply. So last class, we were talking a little bit about professional listening, right? Last class, we brought in the second article that talks about using listening in a diverse multicultural workforce. This knitting and purging reading, right, is getting at some of the ways that we can think about listening across a lot of different backgrounds that impact us in professional settings. We talked about some theoretical approaches, right, including the idea of borderland theory, and that we are constantly kind of crossing between borders and aspects of identity as we listen to each other and communicate in groups. And some of the ideas of cultural skills, including the idea of self-awareness that are crucial to our participation in groups. But recall, again, these authors have these kind of different approaches to thinking about listening. One comes from more of like a phenomenological and Zen approach. One comes from more of a business side approach. Both of them see benefits to listening that are a little bit different, but can still work together to help us to be better at that practice. We also talked about how listening is crucial to understand culture. Again, we'll be building on some of these ideas of things like culture and gender as we get into next week. But again, culture is this combination of traits, traditions, and so on that we share and pass down over time. And also, as we'll be talking a little bit about for today's activity, right, there's challenges of figuring out how to listen and be a good listener if it's difficult to measure what listening is, especially in a more applied or professional field. And lastly, we talked about how we can engage culturally, right? And we can use listening skills in professional settings, knowing some of those challenges with culture. We need to be sensitive, that we need to practice self-awareness. We need to know who we are, right? Who our own biases are, the ways that they impact our listening, and so on. So because we spent Monday going through the first reading, communicating in the business context, we spent last class going through the listening in the multicultural workforce one, I decided to do things a little bit more differently today. Rather than do like any sort of lecture on new material, I thought we could dedicate most of our remaining class time into thinking about and applying some of the stuff that we've been discussing this week. So what I'm going to be doing is giving you a scenario to work on today that relates to some of the challenges surrounding listening in more professional contexts and settings. And the scenario that I want us to think about and work on, right, is that you and your group members are working for a publishing company. Think about it as a company that publishes and puts out things like books, right? Your company's CEO has noticed the company does a poor job for listening to either the coworkers in that company, but also does a poor job of listening to customers. So what I want you to do first is to brainstorm the ways that an advertising company or group could improve its listening skills. How can it engage with things like customers and coworkers thinking about what we know about good ways to use listening skills professionally. Another thing we've brought up a lot this quarter is the idea that listening is a really difficult thing to measure, right? What does it mean to be a good listener is a hard thing to determine. So what I want you to do is to think about how your company might measure or evaluate how much it listens or how good it is at listening to the needs of customers and coworkers. And then lastly, I'd like you to take some time to think about what the benefits are to listening. What does your company or group gain as a result of using good listening skills? So why don't I go ahead and I'm going to divide into slightly smaller groups for this time. So we have 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 14. So 14. Let's do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Do 1, 2, 3, and 4. Then let's do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then Destiny, I'll have you just do some work on this independently. I'm sorry I can't put you in a group, but you're welcome to share your insights and thoughts about this as well. So again, take some time in group 4 or 5 to discuss and think about some answers to these questions.
One way that I was thinking, we could, definitely our coworkers, like, you know, like, our hiring managers, and stuff like that, listening, like, are more than willing to talk to you about issues that you have, like, I think just consistently letting them know that they're available is like, allow them.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Yes. Because, like, the, like, you just send out a suggestion box.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's from both sides actually, like, new workers that come in and say, you know, well, we have.
They can also make it easier for.
Make sure it's like like somebody specific,
Either.
maybe it's like a mid-level guy that has to now, so.
I don't know, I worked at FedEx for a little bit, I always felt cool with, like, drivers as well, and they're like, oh, so, like, we were working in the same building with them, I felt like our manager was always like, hey, if you have a problem with this one, he wouldn't say driver, if you're having a problem with anybody else, let me know. I don't know, just felt like it's always this idea, like, I have that kind of thing.
Yeah, and when I did Safeway, just occasionally send out like an automated corporate email once in a while. Hey, you have problems, go to this website, call this thing, do a survey.
Another thing.
Right.
Around like.
They're pretty cool. Cause I guess if they have any problems. Yeah, exactly. But
But I guess it depends what the company is.
Like after this, we're gonna evaluate each of our options, like how all of us, like, go over the steps.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, so like after a meeting, we're going to have to like, get our board with the customer. Or should we go back to how all of them, you know.
Like an evaluation.
It says
Yeah.
the environment which was
Yeah.
Some of the benefits of having a connection with the customers.
Yeah.
My father was actually turned on there.
Oh, for this?
He does.
Oh.
Never seen that before. I thought it was a sticker on there.
Oh, wow. I guess like, I don't know. Like, everything we're gonna want, like, you remember people or something, like, if they're like. You like remember they kind of have to get like these information, so that could be like a warning, so something like that.
It's like starting
Customers like what their issues are, what you're doing, setting those up.
The worker would be
Yeah, we're satisfied with your services.
Yeah. And like, probably we're gonna come back and get this one too.
So we're gonna need to communicate what's the change. Transparency.
Yeah, a lot of transparency.
But a lot of times we're just generic, yes, we listen to you and we're making changes.
Yeah. Just turn around, like, reply to things back and not doing anything.
In some way showing that you are making changes based on feedback, or at least acknowledging it, not just like generic. Some responses.
Another one.
That's it.
The workplace is becoming less
But you can definitely gain customers.
And so.
Do it for the customer, like, actually give a shit. Then probably more people come to you too. Yeah.
Start making that going more.
Right. Right. And even if you work there, it's other coworkers just treat you like shit, like, I don't know what I was
Yeah.
Especially like a
Yeah,
national.
so building relationships, customers,
Or larger.
Yeah.
Even just something that operates across state lines, so that is local cultures as well.
We'll give you about 5 more minutes or so to continue to work through this.
It's like service.
Yeah. Actually do it.
Yeah, that's kind of.
Some come out. I've answered like questionnaires for like dairy and stuff, because they'll give you a free like ice cream.
Yeah.
So maybe some sort of incentive.
It's a tricky one. It's the only ways to really measure it in-house, kind of less personal. It's-
But that's just.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have no idea.
Are you serious?
Could I open the door for better, like, audience as well, like better things, because if you have a good reputation listening, you'll get more high stakes things. Look at it.
So this, recent employee around the corporation.
Better morale.
That's the big one. Yeah, I watched the quiz.
Oh, they had.
Oh, sure.
I was scared. The midterm but then I asked.
It's not just.
So I'll give you a couple more minutes to finish up, and then I will ask each group to share.
Yeah. No.
After I'll be proud first things like, yeah, this is the first question. Yeah, so I don't know.
No, we had.
We have 5K.
All right, so let's take some time to talk about the scenario and some of the things that we would do to address that. So let's start by hearing from the group on this side. What were things that you all came up with in answering these kinds of questions?
We talked about how listening to coworkers can be different than listening to customers. Talking about how listening to coworkers, we talked about bringing in someone who can do like listening clinic or like a meeting that would focus on listening within the workplace.
Sure.
And then listening to customers, we just talked about the basic like reviews, social media comments, like the pretty standard ways to listen to customers.
Sure.
And then I'm talking about for measuring, for research, like maybe doing like a quarterly, annually, like how y'all feeling? Feeling
Okay.
good, feel listened to, the coffee, doing great. Then listening to customers, measuring by sales and revenue and just overall customer satisfaction rates.
Sure.
And then benefits, of course, money. And then we also talked about for benefits listening to coworkers is lower turnover rates or actually
Sure.
having our employees for a longer period of time.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. I think there's some really good points that your group brought up. A couple things that really stood out in particular, right? One of them being that improving listening could happen through something like a clinic, right? Or outsourcing, having somebody who's a professional when it comes to listening and those types of skills come into the picture, right? To provide that external talent. That can definitely play a role. One way to counteract or maybe deal with the difficulty of measuring listening could be something like doing a survey, assessing the degree to which people feel listened to or supported within their organization. As you all brought up, right? Turnover can be a really big concern. If somebody's working for a company or group and they don't feel like they're being listened to or heard or understood, they're a lot more likely to leave, right? So there's definitely a way that listening skills, even though they can't be measured very easily, right, can have a really big impact on retention and people staying and feeling included. So if you do find yourself in a group or professional setting where you're thinking about these issues of listening, that's definitely one of the biggest tangible impacts that listening can have, right? The overall well-being and cohesion of the group. So thanks for sharing. About the middle group here.
Yeah, so for the first one, we said for both customers and employees, we could either do like a suggestion box or like evaluation forms based on customer and employee interactions. And for the second one, we said it's better for the customers and employees to reach out and say something that they might not want to say in face-to-face, because that way they can kind of have like a hidden identity for their suggestion. We could give like incentives to customers and employees to show that we're listening to them. So for example, like if a customer buys something from the store, we could give them like a 10% discount the next purchase to show like, hey, you bought something, we're listening to you, let's reward you. And for the employees, we could, since we were thinking evaluation forms, we could do like a monthly, like their monthly rating based on customer interactions. We could reward our employees through that. And then for the third thing, we see a few benefits as to like customer loyalty. We could gain better loyalty with existing customers. We could also gain more customers. And then like this group said, we would have less employee turnover. And we would probably have more people that are interested in working for a company that cares about them.
Yeah. So thanks, Zach. I think a couple things that are really important that your group emphasized. First of all, right, if you're asking like employees to share if they feel good about the environment or if they feel being listened to, right, being on the spot, especially face to face, could be really uncomfortable and could create a situation where people don't feel like they're able to listen. So something like a suggestion box or something like a feedback form or survey, right, is a great way to help keep things anonymous. And also, right, if feedback is anonymous, people are more likely to be honest, right, to really share because they're not concerned about the impact and implications of having their information that they share be traced. So that can definitely be an important consideration, is giving people the opportunity to offer feedback. And even by, right, creating those opportunities, people feel like they're putting things out to be listened to. One thing you can do as like a company or group, right, that shows that you're doing good listening is to say, hey, we put together this anonymous feedback, we heard you, here are the specific changes or adjustments that we're making based on the feedback that we've received, right? I think one way that really helps is that a company or group makes it clear that they've understood and that they're doing specific things in response to what they've heard and listened to. So that can definitely play a role. And this group here.
For the first question I wrote down, one way to help coworkers is by allowing coworkers to know that higher ups and managers are always willing to listen to them.
Sure.
For example, like when working at FedEx and stuff, felt like a manager was always telling me like they were willing to listen. We also wrote down that the environment where the issues are also being listened to is very important for the company to set up. Malia was saying like being in a cubicle is kind of bland and not a good listening environment for a manager to listen to some of your issues. So like setting up a conference room or something would be very important. Being transparent with customers, actually responding to issues that are at hand is important for customer satisfaction. Number two, math questionnaires and maybe some incentive for filling out questionnaires. For example, like Dairy Queen gives you a free ice cream cone if you know, fill out one of the questionnaires online. This will give us more information and a way to measure what we need to fix within the company. And then number three, good communication with customers and coworkers creates a positive work environment and prevents any potential lawsuits or issues with the company, as well as creates like a good image for the public to see.
Yeah.
We're actually listening to our coworkers, create a positive work environment.
Yeah, so, right, like you were saying, an employee feels a lot more comfortable if they feel like a supervisor is available to listen. I've mentioned before that in some things like meetings, sometimes they start with something like open discussion, which is a period of time where people can freely raise their concerns or ideas. As you all mentioned, right, the role of physical space is a really important one too. You can think about how, cubicles are pretty segmented off and it's difficult for people to communicate, but using team building activities or having opportunities for people to work together, or again, creating more open space. That's why oftentimes more open office or floor plans are a lot more popular these days, are being included, right? Is out of a desire to maybe include more opportunities for listening and talking to one another. Destiny, is there anything you'd like to jump in on or add that's in response to these questions?
No, not really. I guess I can just kind of give my answer. So for the first one, I put that a way that the group can improve on its listening is by kind of just self-awareness and being able to try and understand one another. And that way everybody can just engage. And for specifically like coworkers, I said that they could do maybe like a team bonding activity to establish a little bit more of that closeness.
Yeah.
And also, I guess, put their thoughts out there to be able to understand like what needs to be improved upon. And then I said the company might measure how much it listens to customers and coworkers by basically just, I said a survey maybe, asking how well their needs are being met and if they're satisfied basically.
Yeah.
And then one of the benefits I said is just like a happier workplace, and obviously people will want to engage more with the company.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing, Destiny. I know you're all on your own there, but I thought that you added some really good ideas here. Again, the use of things like surveys and other ways to measure and get that data together are really good ways that we can just get that physical material that helps us understand what we can do to improve our listening. So good observations all around in terms of how we can create good listening skills. You might think about incorporating these on your own if you're involved in a group or professional organization in the future. So we talked about, again, the listening assessment, had you all share what you put together, the ways that we engage in professional groups with listening, and some of the ways to help us to think about how we can measure and apply listening in professional settings. Next Monday, we'll be talking about how gender and culture impact listening, again, getting a deeper dive into culture, but also thinking about some of the ways that our listening is oftentimes gendered and impacted by many of these kinds of differences. So have a great weekend. Go ahead and pass forward or email me your activity for today. And I look forward to seeing you all again next week. Have a great weekend and see you soon.